The air in the room was tight, the kind of silence that pretends to be professional while quietly daring someone to speak first. But no one did. Laptop stayed open, untouched. A spreadsheet waited between us like a verdict that had already been reached. The silence only made me feel colder. Indeed, I was sitting right next to the fireplace, and the cold was seeping to my bones. How about where you live? What's the temperature like right now? And if you're still listening, please leave your lucky number below so I know. Miles Reddick, the chief operating officer, finally broke the silence. He rotated his laptop and slid a spreadsheet toward me. New budget, he said, voice calm enough to sound rehearsed. The market value of this role has changed. I didn't need to scroll far. My compensation had been cut in half, effective immediately, no transition period, no performance review, just a clean subtraction, as if the years behind that number had never existed. I asked one question, evenly, because anything louder would have been a concession. Is this decision final? Miles nodded once. He was famous for decisive restructuring, not for building anything that lasted. I was the strategic architect who designed the margin optimization formula that stabilized our revenue and carried us through 3 volatile quarters. I built leverage quietly. He reduced people loudly. The meeting ended exactly on time. No follow-ups, no eye contact. Back at my desk, I opened my laptop and navigated past folders no one else had ever asked about. One directory sat untouched, time-stamped from nights and weekends the company never paid for. Its label was plain, independent work, archive. I clicked it once, slowly, and understood something very clearly. They had cut my salary. They had not purchased my silence, my loyalty. Before we continue, I want to share a small note. This story is partially fictionalized and uses artificial intelligence to help clarify ideas and create a deeper emotional impact. I hope it resonates with you, and if it doesn't, feel free to step away, get some rest, and take care of yourself. Your health matters more than any story. I learned very quickly what wasn't written in my contract. It lived in habits, expectations, and favors no one ever documented. The formula that carried the company through its hardest quarters was built after hours. On my own laptop, coffee rings on the desk, spreadsheets saved under my name, it lifted operating margins by 13%. Quietly, without bonuses or headlines. After the pay cut, Miles didn't stop there. He removed my approval rights under the excuse of streamlining. Reports I authored were reassigned minutes before meetings, presented by managers who couldn't explain the assumptions behind them. I sat in the room, listening to my own work spoken back to me in a thinner voice. When I pushed once, carefully, Miles smiled. The system doesn't depend on individuals, he said, as if repeating a rule made it true. The room nodded. I didn't. I wrote it down instead. So I adjusted. I delivered exactly what my role required, and nothing more. No late-night refinements, no quiet corrections before deadlines. The formula kept running, but it stopped evolving. I watched small inefficiencies pile up like dust no one wanted to see. The restraint took effort. Every instinct told me to fix things. I didn't. I let the silence do the work. A week later, an email arrived from an address I recognized immediately. It was brief, precise, and careful. We'd like to speak privately about your pricing methodology. I closed my inbox, felt the balance shift, and stayed quiet instead today. We met after work, away from conference rooms and calendars that pretended neutrality. The cafe was quiet enough to discourage small talk, which suited me. I didn't come to be impressed. I came to listen. They didn't introduce themselves with titles. That was deliberate. Instead, one of them said, "We've followed your work for a long time." I nodded once and waited. Silence has a way of inviting precision. I made my boundaries clear early. Before we go any further, I said, the formula you're referring to was developed independently. Personal equipment, personal time. It has never been licensed, formally or informally. I watched their reaction carefully. No surprise. Just interest sharpening into focus. They asked if the company I worked for owned it. I answered without hesitation. No. They were permitted to use it while I maintained it. That's all. The distinction mattered. It always does. The conversation stayed technical, measured. They didn't ask for details. They didn't need to. What they wanted was assurance. We'd require a license, one of them said. With full IP warranty, clean chain of ownership, no gray areas. I told them I understood. I also told them I wasn't ready to decide. I don't rush agreements, I said, especially when silence is still doing its job. They smiled at that. The kind of smile reserved for people who recognize leverage when they saw it. We stood to leave without shaking hands. Nothing had been exchanged except clarity. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in weeks. I didn't go home. I walked instead, letting the city absorb the excess tension I no longer needed. When my phone vibrated, I already knew who it was. The message from my attorney was short, precise, comforting. There is no work-for-hire clause covering that material. I stopped walking. The control I'd been holding quietly settled into place. This wasn't a move yet, but the board was finally clear. And for the first time since the meeting with Miles, I felt ahead of the conversation again. Pressure arrived quietly, disguised as urgency. After weeks of stalled negotiations, the company lost 2 major bids in the same quarter. Contracts everyone had assumed were guaranteed. Meetings multiplied. Voices sharpened. The word timeline began replacing strategy. Miles Reddick reacted the way he always did when results slipped. He ordered teams to move faster, to compress review cycles, to approve assumptions that used to require debate. We don't have time for perfection, he said. Execution wins markets. I watched the strain show in places he couldn't restructure. Late emails, shorter tempers, requests that contradicted his own policies from a month earlier. He needed momentum, and he needed it immediately. I gave him exactly what my contract required. Nothing more. Reports were delivered on time, formatted correctly, stripped of the quiet adjustments I used to make instinctively. When numbers conflicted, I documented the discrepancy instead of resolving it. When projections felt thin, I flagged the risk and moved on. That restraint irritated him more than resistance would have. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk, lowering his voice as if that made the message gentler. You should remember you're being paid to support the company, he said. Not a threat, a reminder, the kind meant to reassert hierarchy without putting anything on record. I am. I replied, and it was true. The pressure built anyway. Deals kept slipping. Questions circled upward. Miles began attending meetings he used to skip, listening more than speaking, his pen tapping whenever assumptions were challenged. By then, my decision was already procedural. The terms had been reviewed, the boundaries confirmed. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn anyone. That evening, after the office cleared, I signed the licensing agreement on my personal device. The document was clean, limited, enforceable. When I closed the file, the tension didn't disappear, but it shifted direction, for the first time since the cuts. The pressure wasn't on me anymore. It sat with me as proof that preparation, not protest, was finally dictating the pace, and that silence, when used correctly, could apply far more force than urgency ever did before. If you believe choosing restraint over reaction was the right move, leave any number in the comments below. Your voice deserves to be seen and shared. News of the loss didn't arrive with drama. It arrived as a press release. The competitor announced a $300 million win, complete with confident quotes and a slide deck that looked painfully familiar. I read it twice. Not because I was surprised, but because the symmetry was almost elegant. Inside our office, reactions unfolded in stages. First denial, then questions, then the uncomfortable realization that the math worked. The same formula, the same assumptions, the same calm discipline I had once defended in meetings where Miles insisted speed mattered more than rigor. Now it was winning for someone else. Legal called an emergency review and asked me to sit in. Their tone was careful. "They have a license," one attorney said, tapping the screen. "Clean, limited, fully warranted." Another added, "We don't." No one looked at me. They didn't need to. The silence did the accounting. I kept my voice neutral. "Is there an issue with infringement?" I asked. "No." Legal replied. They did everything correctly. That answer carried a strange relief, not triumph. Relief? It meant the line had been drawn exactly where I'd intended. By mid-afternoon, sales leaders were already asking how to counter an offer built on our former advantage. There was no counter. Without a licensed warranty, clients wouldn't sign. Risk committees wouldn't approve. The formula wasn't forbidden. It was simply unusable in the rooms that mattered. Miles paced. He spoke faster than usual. Words colliding. "Set up a call." He said, "We need to understand how this happened." Someone finally said it aloud. "They're licensed." The irony settled in quietly. Same work, same logic. Two outcomes. One protected by paperwork, one stranded by assumptions. I didn't celebrate. I updated my notes, closed my laptop, and waited. Minutes later, my calendar filled itself. "Miles wants an emergency meeting." The invite read. I accepted without comment, already aware that urgency had changed sides, and that satisfaction, when earned patiently, never needs to announce itself. I straightened my jacket, noted the time, and reminded myself that control looks ordinary until results arrive. And by then, the record speaks louder than any meeting ever could in this building tonight alone. Nothing was taken away from us. That was the part everyone struggled to accept. The formula still existed. The spreadsheet still opened. The logic still worked. What changed was quieter, colder, and far more final. Clients began asking a new question during diligence calls, not about pricing, not about speed, about ownership. "Can you provide an IP warranty for this methodology?" they asked. Politely, professionally. It wasn't an accusation. It was a requirement. We couldn't. Legal tried to soften it. "We've used it internally for years." Procurement didn't care. Risk committees didn't either. Without a licensed warranty, the model couldn't be approved, not banned, just excluded. That distinction mattered. It meant no one was at fault externally, only internally misinformed. Miles didn't handle the shift well. His voice rose in meetings where it never used to. "We built this." He snapped once. "They can't just walk away with it." Someone reminded him, carefully, that no one had walked away with anything. The room went still. He demanded answers that didn't exist. He asked legal for leverage they couldn't invent. He asked sales to push anyway. Clients declined anyway. The formula wasn't illegal. It was simply unusable in any deal that mattered. I stayed quiet. I answered direct questions. I documented everything else. Silence, at that point, was not avoidance. It was accuracy. The pressure condensed. Miles stopped delegating and started hovering. His anger wasn't theatrical. It was sharp, controlled, and pointed inward. The kind that knows it has nowhere useful to land. Then the board stepped in. They didn't ask about competitors. They asked about decisions, about approvals, about who evaluated the risk of depending on something we didn't own. "We need a responsibility report." The chair said, not raised voice, just process. As the meeting ended, I closed my notebook and felt nothing dramatic. No victory, no relief, just a steady awareness that power rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly, through preparation, restraint, and the patience to let systems reveal exactly who misunderstood them first. When the board requested documentation, panic entered the building through email, not voices. Messages that once felt routine were suddenly treated like evidence. Compliance pulled threads carefully, retrieving internal emails, approvals, and changelogs that had never been written with scrutiny in mind. I was asked to provide my records first. I did. Without commentary. What followed was faster than anyone expected. Chains of messages surfaced showing how compensation adjustments had been justified, who proposed them, and who signed. Dates aligned, Language repeated itself. Miles Reddick's name appeared at the bottom of more than one decision. His signature sat neatly beneath the reduction notice, framed by phrases like market realignment and cost discipline in isolation. They sounded strategic. Together. They sounded deliberate. The board meeting that followed was brief and surgical. No speeches, no theatrics. One director leaned forward and asked him directly, "Who determined that this contribution was worth half its previous value?" Miles didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his pen, glanced at the screen, then said, "It was a necessary adjustment, based on what analysis another voice pressed." The room tightened, slides advanced, comparisons appeared. Revenue curves before and after the formula stabilized operations, client retention during volatile quarters. The contrast was impossible to miss. This model underpinned 2/3 of our enterprise pricing, the chair said evenly. "And you concluded it was overvalued," Miles tried to reframe. "No single individual is indispensable," he said, repeating his favorite line. "That wasn't the question." The chair replied. Silence followed, heavy and exacting, for the first time since he arrived. Miles looked cornered, not by emotion, but by his own paperwork. When the meeting adjourned, no conclusions were announced. Instead, a notice circulated within the hour. An internal investigation would begin immediately, focused on decision authority, risk evaluation, and governance failures. I returned to my desk and opened a fresh document, labeling it carefully. The pressure had reversed direction now, and I understood that once accountability enters the room, it never leaves quietly. From that moment forward, every decision slowed, every email carried weight, and every signature became visible. Company-wide impact. What do you think about Miles choosing to cut compensation and defend it with paperwork instead of understanding the value behind the work? Share your perspective below. Your insight might help others see this situation more clearly. By the time Miles called me into his office, the air had lost all pretense of civility. He didn't offer a seat. He didn't waste time. "This ends now," he said. "We'll pursue legal action if necessary." I listened without interrupting. His argument came out in fragments: breach, loyalty, proprietary knowledge. None of it landed. When he finished, I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table between us. "This is the license," I said. "Signed. Enforceable. Limited." He stared at it, then pushed it back, as if distance could change its contents. "You can't do this," he said. "That work belongs to us." "It doesn't," I replied. "And it never did." His voice sharpened. "We invested in you. You paid my salary." I said, "You didn't purchase my nights, my equipment, or my independent work." The room tightened. Miles leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If you think this protects you, you're mistaken." "It already has," I said, and stood. There was nothing theatrical about the moment. No raised voices, just two people recognizing the limits of their leverage. He had threats. I had documentation. In the weeks that followed, his threats went nowhere. Legal stalled. Risk committees hesitated. Every move required justification that no one wanted to sign. Meanwhile, the competitor kept moving. New contracts, expanded regions. Their offers became the standard others compared themselves against. Sales teams began referencing them by name. Inside our company, meetings grew shorter and quieter. Miles stopped calling me in. He didn't need to. The outcome was already circulating. I watched the market shift without expression. This wasn't revenge. It was alignment. By the time quarterly numbers came in, the truth was unavoidable. The company hadn't lost a formula. It had lost control over when and how it could be used, and the gap kept widening. Silence followed, and no one questioned who now held leverage inside the room. The announcement came quietly, buried in a routine internal update that avoided names and avoided drama. Miles Reddick was no longer with the company due to strategic decision failures. That was the phrasing. No apology, no explanation, just distance. By then, the damage was already visible. Clients hesitated, Deals that once closed in weeks dragged into months. Competitors framed their proposals around reliability and license certainty, and we had no clean answer. The market noticed. Reputation eroded faster than revenue. I stayed, not out of loyalty, but because my contract still made sense. I delivered what was required, documented risks, and stopped rescuing decisions that weren't mine to fix. There was a strange clarity in that discipline. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just removes the wrong person and lets gravity finish the work. The board moved quickly after Miles left, but not effectively. Rebuilding trust takes longer than issuing statements. Senior leaders asked for my input more often, carefully now, as if they were relearning how value actually entered the room. I never mentioned the license. I didn't need to. Everyone understood what had changed. 2 weeks later, an email arrived from outside the company. A consulting firm representing several enterprise buyers asked if I would consider an independent advisory role. Limited scope, transparent terms, full respect for boundaries. I reread the message once, then closed my laptop. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had remained exactly where I was, doing exactly what I was paid to do, while the world quietly adjusted around a truth that had always existed. Cold justice isn't about punishment, it's about alignment. And alignment, once restored, has a way of opening doors without ever announcing that it has done so. It left me steady, employed, and unafraid, watching systems correct themselves while opportunity waited patiently. Knowing silence had done its work better than any confrontation ever could before now. By the time everything settled, there was no victory speech waiting for me, no urge to explain myself. I was still at my desk, still doing the work outlined in my contract, and strangely lighter for it. The noise had faded, replaced by a calm that only comes after you stop fighting battles that were never yours to win. People assume this was revenge. It wasn't. I didn't take anything from them. I didn't sabotage systems or burn bridges. I simply chose where my work belonged. The formula remained exactly what it had always been: careful, precise, and mine. The only difference was the environment willing to respect it. I learned something quiet but permanent. Loyalty without boundaries becomes erosion. Silence, when intentional, becomes leverage. And dignity is preserved not by staying angry, but by staying aligned with your own terms. When I look back, the outcome feels almost ordinary. A company corrected itself, a market adjusted, and I kept moving forward without raising my voice. I didn't take anything from them. I only carried what I created to the place that understood its value. That choice restored my balance, confidence, and the certainty that choosing yourself can be enough. What stayed with me after all of this wasn't the contracts or the meetings. It was the realization that most damage at work doesn't come from cruelty, it comes from quiet assumptions. Assumptions that your effort is unlimited, that your loyalty is automatic, that what you build somehow stops being yours because it helped someone else succeed. The practical lesson is simple, but uncomfortable boundaries are not betrayal. Knowing what belongs to you, your time, your thinking, your creativity, and protecting it isn't selfish. It's how you stay whole. I learned how much resentment grows when silence is forced, and how much lighter life feels when silence is chosen instead. If you were in that room, watching your value reduced to a number on a screen, what would you do? Would you fight loudly and risk burning everything down? Would you leave immediately and hope for the best? Or would you stay, steady and quiet, and let your choices, not your anger, speak for you? None of those answers are easy, but pretending you don't have a choice is the only one that guarantees regret. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, years of effort, swallowed frustration, unspoken compromises, I want you to know this story isn't about winning, it's about dignity, and dignity spreads quietly, person to person. Thank you for being here and staying with this story. If you believe stories like this can help someone rethink their worth, consider subscribing. A single subscription, a like, or a share helps this reach someone who might need it more than they realize. And if you have thoughts or doubts of your own, leave a comment. Your voice could be exactly what someone else needs to hear.